Hello, everybody, and welcome to this seminar in our Roehampton series. And this one today is focusing on universal basic income. I'm very pleased that you're joining us today at Roehampton University, and we've got three really excellent speakers, only two of them with us at the moment, because I'm afraid one of them is having technical issues coming in from Kenya, but we're optimistic that he'll be joining us later. So my name is Molly Scott-Cato, and I'm a professor of green economics at Roehampton University. When I became that, I was the only one in the world. I'm possibly still the only one in the world, but you know, there's an opportunity for others to join me. And I was also a Green MEP until January this year. I've been a supporter of universal basic income for decades, I think I can safely say. I'm not going to pretend to be objective about this. I think it's a tremendous idea. And it also feels like an idea whose time has really come in the middle of this pandemic, because for me, universal basic income is all about changing our relationship with the labour market. And we've all had to do that in different ways as a result of COVID-19. And it's really given us this chance to rethink how we relate to work, how we share work, how we relate work to livelihoods and our basic social security. And I also like universal basic income because it thinks about our work in terms of commons rather than in terms of the market. And to me, it's a more sociable, it's a less sort of exploitative way of thinking about work. Now, we've seen in recent weeks that the Chancellor's furlough scheme is coming to an end, lots of people losing their jobs, and many, many people were never covered by the so-called safety net. The safety net was full of holes, and for lots of people, especially self-employed people, they didn't have any support from the government in spite of losing their income and their ability to earn for themselves. And just today we had musicians outside the House of Commons playing to say, you know, they're all destitute, and where is their safety net? And this is why I think there's so much interest in universal basic income right now, because it's a sort of flexible policy that we need to give people that basic social security. As I said, I've been a supporter of this for several decades now, but this really feels to me the time for UBI. And I would say it's a policy whose time has come. And it's received a great deal of media attention and political attention in the past 9 months or so. In the UK, there was a letter signed by lots of MPs, I think 100 MPs now supporting universal basic income. And a poll showed that 51% of British people are actually in support of this proposal as well. And in March, Senator Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for UBI as a response to COVID-19. So, you know, both sides of the Atlantic, it's now under discussion. And in some countries, there's, you know, people are making more progress and there are actually pilot studies or actual schemes underway, as we're going to hear later. So I'll just outline to you how the session is going to run. It'll run for about an hour. And in a minute, I'll introduce our speakers to you, and then we'll move on to Guy Standing, who's a world expert on universal basic income, and he'll speak for about 20 minutes. And then we've got two other speakers who will speak for less time and sort of responding to Guy, but also sharing their research insights in different countries. And then we'll move on to questions. I'll probably ask the speakers a few questions, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask questions and interact with the speakers as well. So let me just introduce our excellent speakers to you. First, we have Dr. Guy Standing, and he's a professorial research associate at SOAS in the University of London. He holds an economics PhD from the University of Cambridge and is co-founder and honorary co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network and a member of the Progressive Economy Forum. He's also advised Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell on economics, and he has been a professor at SOAS, at Bath and at Monash universities. He was research director for President Nelson Mandela's Labour Market Policy Commission, and he's designed several basic income pilot schemes. You won't be surprised to hear that he's written several books on UBI, including Plunder of the Commons, a manifesto for sharing public wealth, which is his most recent book. And he also has become something of a rock star in recent months because he collaborated with Massive Attack on a musical based on his most recent book. Sorry, this is his most recent book, Battling 8 Giants, Basic Income Now. I expect he'll tell us a little bit more about that in a minute. So then we have Dr. Liz Foxman. Did I say that right? Oh, she's agreeing with me, that's good. She's a Leverhulme Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, based at the African Studies Centre, and also a Research Fellow at St John's College. Liz has a doctorate in international development from the University of Oxford, and she has held research fellowships at Harvard University and the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Liz's research focuses on understanding moral, social, and cultural attachments to work and working in an increasingly unequal, precarious, and automated world. In particular, she focuses on the ways that the long-term unemployed in Southern Africa think about the links between work and income, including ideas based around radical redistributive justice, which is where the UBI comes in. She complements her research in Southern Africa with comparative case studies in the global north, and I hope she's going to share with us something she knows about recent case study or pilot study of UBI in Finland. Now, our third speaker, who hasn't joined us yet, but we're keeping our fingers crossed, is Professor Israel Kodiaga, who is the founder and president of the Universal Basic Income Kenya, which is a program developed by Global Unification International, where Israel is the Director General for African Affairs. And of course, he champions the cause for basic income for all. The program is associated with the Basic Income Earth Network. Israel also serves as the Director of Programs, Research and Strategic Development at the African Center for International Studies. And his research aims to inform policy responses at regional and international level. He has a degree in education from Kenyatta University and an MA in the philosophy of history. He's also worked on project management, peace studies, marketing, and business administration. Sounds a fascinating CV. I hope he sorts out his technical issues successfully. Anyway, let's move on now to our first speaker, and I'm very excited to hear, and I'm sure you are too, from Guy Standing. Over to you, Guy.
Thank you very much, Molly, and it's great to be sharing this platform with some of the others. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is summarize my arguments from my recent books, 2 of which you've mentioned. And I think that this is an opportunity to say that fundamentally the case for a basic income is ethical and moral, not economic or instrumental. Most of the attention of commentators concentrate on the economic aspects and the pros and cons vis-a-vis other forms of social security, but I think fundamentally it's a matter of ethical justification. First of all, I should define what a basic income is, because a lot of people labor under misunderstandings about it. I never use the term universal basic income because for practical reasons, you're going to have some entitlement restrictions. I am a British citizen, but I live and work in Europe. And therefore, if there was a British basic income, someone like me would not actually be receiving it. Similarly, if you accept migrants, and we should accept migrants, you would have to have some sort of waiting period before they would be entitled to receive it. It's also important to realize that it would be a modest payment paid regularly in a money or money equivalent. In other words, not like a voucher or a subsidy. And it would be paid equally to men and women, regardless of work status, regardless of marital status or household status or any other status. And it would be non-withdrawable. In other words, it's a right, not a matter of charity or social assistance or whatever, a means-tested system. It's not means-tested. You could claw back from the wealthy. The objection that why give to the wealthy as well as the poor is that it's actually much better to give everybody who qualifies a basic amount and then alter the tax rate, if you wish, to tax back from the wealthy. Another important point to bear in mind in the discussion, which is often ignored, deliberately by the minister recently in answering a debate in the House of Commons, a debate around the petitions committee, because there was a petition delivered to the House of Commons signed by a huge number of people, and therefore they had to debate it. And he said, well, it's not targeting. What about the disabled? Well, we always say that there should be supplements, special benefits for those people who have extra costs of living and a lower probability of earning than the average person. So you would have separate benefits, and that is a separate issue. Now, the really important thing is to think about what are the ethical justifications, because what we're saying is that a basic income should be the base of a new income distribution system. And the first justification is that it's a matter of common justice. Molly, you mentioned the commons earlier, and I really believe that is the fundamental basis for justifying a basic income. Under the Charter of the Forest of 1217, everybody has the right of subsistence. Everybody has a right to material that can give them subsistence. And yet throughout British history and the history of other countries, systematically the commons, which belong to all of us, natural, social, civil commons, and so on, have been taken away illegitimately, and that has contributed to the grotesque levels of inequality today. It's a matter of common justice. And if you allow for private inheritance of private wealth, which is a lot of something for nothing given to a minority, think of a commons dividend on the public wealth that we've inherited as being a justification. It's also a matter, if you're religious, of religious justice. I'm not religious, but if you are religious, you will understand the principle that God has given unequal talents, and the basic income is, in a sense, a compensation for those who have been gifted with lesser talents or talents that don't result in them making a lot of money. And I was very pleased that Pope Francis, a few weeks ago, finally came out in favor, strongly in favor, of a basic income. And I thought that was quite a good moment. I think it's also a matter of intergenerational justice. I gave a talk in Middlesbrough last year, and Middlesbrough basically provided the wealth of Britain in the Industrial Revolution. If you go to Middlesbrough now, the descendants of those who worked and produced that wealth are in poverty and they're part of the precariat, whereas the toffs, who are the descendants of the bosses who are living down in other parts of the country, are making a lot of money. So in terms of justice, you can argue that a basic income is justifiable. There are other justice arguments which I've developed in the books. The second justification is that a basic income would enhance freedom. It would enhance libertarian freedom, freedom to say no, the freedom to make choices in a market economy. That's why someone on the right, like Milton Friedman, came round to supporting it. But it's more importantly, it supports liberal freedom, the freedom to be moral. You can't be moral if you have to do what a bureaucrat tells you to do, as in universal credit, or what a parent or what a spouse tells you to do, or some landlord or whatever. You can only be morally free if you have the security to be able to make such decisions for yourself. And that, I think, goes with Republican freedom, which I believe every Green and everybody on the left should be supporting. The freedom to be able to say no to figures of unaccountable authority. And that leads to the third ethical justification, which is particularly important today. Basic income, even if it were less than enough to give subsistence, as we've found with our pilots in Africa and in India and Latin America, even if it's below that level, it enhances basic security. Basic security is a human need. Basic security is also a public good, and it's a superior public good, because if more and more people have basic security, the value to any individual goes up. I can easily show that. But today we're facing uncertainty, where you can't calculate the probability of being hit or the difficulty of responding to it. And basic security has been shown by psychologists in lots of research to enhance the IQ, to broaden the mental bandwidth. If you are chronically insecure, your mental bandwidth shrinks, your IQ shrinks, and your capacity to make rational decisions shrinks. Therefore, it is morally unfair to expect people who are chronically insecure to be making the judgments that we think they should be making. And I think basic security is a key argument that people today in this pandemic are beginning to appreciate. And that leads to the economic side, and I'm having to be very, very brief. The economic side, and my new book that's just been mentioned that came out in March but was written last year, the essential argument is this, that the economic system that has been built up in the last 40 years has created an incredibly fragile economy and society. And I draw on William Beveridge, whose famous 1942 report led to an epoch-defining welfare state system in the post-war era. And he wrote on page 2, "This is a time for revolutions, not patching." And he said the challenge was to slay 5 giants: disease, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and want. My argument is that under the globalization and under rentier capitalism, with its excessive financialization, we have had a new class structure that's developed with the precariat. That's millions of people are in the precariat. And I give talks on the precariat more than on any other subject. It's a global phenomenon. People living bits and pieces lives and not having a sense of belonging. But it's created 8 modern giants. The 8 are as follows. First, inequality, which is higher than we've ever had. And inequality of wealth is much greater than inequality of income. Much of the income of the plutocracy is squirreled away in tax havens, we know that, and tax avoidance schemes, etc. But the essence of the inequality is that wealth has risen in Britain from 300% of GDP to over 700% in the last 30 years. And over 60% of all wealth in Britain today is inherited wealth. That is a shocking situation. And to make things even worse, the government operates subsidy schemes and tax relief schemes, which transfers millions and millions of pounds to the very wealthy. A basic income won't remove all inequality, but by being universal in concept, it would enable a more equal distribution within the labor market and across society. It would start a process much more effectively than trying to return to the tax system of the past, which wouldn't work today in an open economy. The second giant is insecurity. And the giant of insecurity has been shown recently, a couple of months ago, by an incredible report in Britain showing that there's been an explosion of anxiety disorders in Britain since 1998, gradually going up, but in the last few years shot up. Huge numbers of people are chronically insecure, and the insecurities result in the third giant, which is stress. We have a pandemic of stress that existed before the pandemic of COVID hit us, but of course, COVID is making things much worse. Stress itself causes those preconditions that lead to the probability of dying from a COVID virus or some other virus that'll come along very soon to increase dramatically. Stress leads to cardiac problems, ulcers, cancers, type 2 diabetes, and so on. And we need a strategy for reducing stress in society. Liz may talk about this in connection with work, and therefore I won't deal with that aspect. But stress is a giant that we need to slay. And the fourth giant is related to the other three, of course, which is the explosion of private debt. Before the pandemic struck, Britain had an unprecedentedly high level of unsecured private debt of over 255 billion pounds. It's gone much worse now. And a difference between the Spanish flu, which was a pandemic which killed about 50 million people around the world 100 years ago today, and now, is that at that time, both private and corporate debt in the major countries was a fraction of what it is today. We have private debt that is over 150% of GDP. That is an extraordinarily high level, on top of which there's corporate debt, which is going to lead to a tumbling of bankruptcies. Debt means that if you even have a slight economic shock, millions of people can't service their debts. And they will be out in the food banks to a greater degree than now. And there will be suicides and deaths of despair, et cetera, associated with that growing debt. Basic income, as we've seen with pilots in Canada and various other places, leads to a greater control of debt, an ability to handle shocks and not go into greater debt, and really has a pivotal effect on getting debt under control. At the moment, we don't have that capacity. And that leads to the fifth giant, the giant of precarity. One of the scandals of British social policy, and American and other countries the same, is that more and more people in the precariat feel like supplicants. They have to appeal to figures of authority for discretionary favors. The original word precarity in Latin was to obtain by prayer. And if you're in the precariat, you have to rely on discretionary judgments of Job Center plus, or whatever it might be, and various others in order to get something. And you face a lack of due process in universal credit or any other system that's out there that's deliberately schemed so as to penalize people. Literally 5 million people have been sanctioned since 2012 under our so-called social protection system. And often it's proven 9-10 months later that they were sanctioned illegitimately, and they win an appeal, but they've lost 9 months of income security, and many of them don't make it. Precarity is an evil part of the modern society we're living in, and it's got worse with this pandemic. And that leads to the sixth giant, the robots. People think we're all going to be displaced by robots and AI and so on. I disagree. I think the disruptive effects of the technological revolution are incredible. And the technological revolution is increasing the rentier capitalism and the inequalities that go with it. So I think we should be actually encouraging many forms of automation, but we can't do it if we have millions of people insecure without income security. And that leads to the seventh giant, which to me is the giant that will tip the majority in favor of basic income. And as we speak and listen, that is precisely what is happening. And that is the threat of extinction. We know today that that threat is us. It's today we are on the front line of the threat to extinction, not just all of nature. I say just, that's wrong word, because everything is interconnected. Everything depends on us dealing with this terrifying ecological threat. We need eco-taxes. We need high levels of eco-taxes. But we will only get them politically if we can deal with the complaint that they are regressive, that they will increase inequality because they're pro rata. And that means they're higher for a low-income person than others. And therefore, they must be combined with a guarantee that the revenue raised from such taxes will be recycled to everybody as equal payments. And as they found in British Columbia, and they found in various other places where they've been raising eco-taxes, as in where I'm living now in Switzerland, once you do that combination, then suddenly people find it a very sensible thing they want to support. If we had a basic income, we would also have an ecological effect by encouraging different forms of work than labor. We would give people an ability to make choices about how much time they spend on care work, now called essential work. It's a benefit for women, it's a benefit for all of us, because we should want to be doing more voluntary work, community work, care work, relative to boring jobs. That leads to the eighth giant. In my book of 2011, The Precariat, on page 1, I said, unless the insecurities of the precariat are addressed, we will see the emergence of a political monster. And on November the 3rd or 4th, whatever it was, in 2016, I started receiving a deluge of emails from around the world saying, your monster has arrived. We are in a frightening moment where that monster could still be re-elected president of the United States. And the monster is a reflection of this eighth giant, which is neo-fascist populism, which is a consequence of millions of people living in fear, living in security, and being told by populist politicians that yesterday was better than today, and therefore let's bring it back. Boris Johnson played on that with Brexit and so on. I think this is a frightening giant. I believe that if we had a basic income system where everybody had basic security, politically, we would defeat that giant. And that leads me to my last few points, which are these. You're listening to a strange man who's been involved in piloting basic income in 4 continents. Methodologies have differed. Methodologies, designs, implementations have differed. About 20 proper pilots have been conducted in different parts of the world. And what is remarkable is the results are consistent with one another. First and foremost, every pilot that I've seen has resulted in a reduction of mental ill health and stress, a greater capacity to look after your health, in some cases dramatically so. It's also led to better nutrition, better schooling, improved status for women, improved status for people with disabilities. But the point I want to make, because politicians are mischievous and misrepresent this every single day, is that every pilot that I've seen and been involved in and designing and implementing has resulted in an increase in wealth, in work, an increase in work, not a reduction in work. And I feel like shouting that. 1 minute, so I've got 1 minute to shout it again. Because for me, this is very important. In our big Indian pilots, we saw work increase, people having a portfolio of activities, output increasing, income distribution getting better. And we've seen it in Africa, we've seen it in Canada, and we've seen it in the United States in the recent months. And we even saw it in a televised program in Britain, in which I was involved, where we provided a number of families with basic income, and then they were followed for a few months to see how they were reacting. For me, basic income is not a panacea. It must be part of a new progressive agenda that's ecologically grounded and distributively grounded. But it is an essential part of the response to this COVID, because there's one overriding lesson. The resilience of all of us will depend on the resilience of the weakest and most vulnerable groups in our society. The measures this government is following, and the measures the Labour Party have been tinkering with and supporting, will not give resilience to the precariat or those below them in our spectrum of incomes. We need that resilience, and that's why it is now an economic imperative as well as an ethical one. Thank you very much.
It always seems a shame on Zoom that you can't clap very effectively, but I'm clapping here, and that was a tremendous tour de force, and I'm really sorry that I had to stop you, but I am the timekeeper. So I had a few questions, sort of technical questions I was going to explore with you, but actually you've answered all of them. I'm just going to ask one quick question. If anybody listening has questions, then please do put them in the box, and they'll get conveyed to me and I can raise them with Guy later on. But for now, Guy, I just wanted to check out this one thing, because you mentioned the need for basic security and how this isn't really about welfare, but I've always really loathed that distinction that's used, you know, dividing people between strivers and skivers. It's obviously nonsense, because if we live long enough, you know, if we're lucky to live long enough, we're all going to get pensions. So we're all defined as skivers, I suppose, at that point. But, you know, it just undermines this idea that we all rely on each other. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying about universalism. And I just wanted to, I like the universal aspects of UBI, but I just wanted to check out with you, you know, how do we convey that to people, that the universal nature of it is its benefit? Of course, I agree with you, there'll be a definition about who can get it. But to me, that really helps to undermine that sort of invidious rhetoric, divisive rhetoric. I just wanted to know what your view was about that.
I think the principle of universalism is essential, absolutely essential. I think one of the worst features of today's means-tested social security system is that it undermines the solidaristic nature of social protection system. If you can do those dualisms, which the government has been doing, Ian Duncan Smith has been doing it ever since 2010, accentuating it, you divide people and you make people think that it's all right, you can treat the welfare people as separate. And that, of course, is why the level of benefits paid to the unemployed in Britain has gone down from over 30% back in 1970 to about 13-14% of average wages today, because people don't feel that sense of solidarity. So I think that is an important principle, and I hate, as much as you've just implied, that dualism. Disgusting. It's totally incorrect, and they should look in the mirror sometimes, those people making this statement.
Okay, I think we're on the same page there. Right, so
so.
Remember, if you have technical issues or political questions or economic questions you want to raise about the proposal, do send them along and we'll raise them with Guy a bit later. But first, I'm turning to Liz Foxman now and looking forward to hearing her contribution, maybe responding a little bit to Guy, but also telling us about her own research.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I'm Liz Foxman. I'm an economic anthropologist based at the University of Oxford. And as an economic anthropologist, basically, I'm going to talk about a lot of the themes that Guy has developed, but kind of inject a bit of empirics into these exact same arguments. So my work is fundamentally interested in why universal basic income is seen as a radical or unusual or strange intervention. Often when it's initially mentioned to someone, their first reaction is one of kind of caution or wonderment. And this is especially true if you compare the way people react to the UBI idea to, for instance, universal healthcare. In most places in the world, other than the US, universal healthcare seems a very intuitive, non-controversial idea, whereas universal basic income, between the two, we can draw a lot of parallels, seems like something very much outside the ordinary. And usually the kind of research that asks this sort of question and asks more broadly, what are the main blocks that's stopping universal basic income from being implemented, typically is focused on political elites or politicians. And I think that's a necessary but insufficient focus. I think political elites are a main source of blockage to basic income. But my own work actually focuses not on elites, but rather on those that would benefit most from something like a basic income. So there are people for whom wage work has failed and is going to continue failing to provide a stable basic livelihood. So I do empirical research with the long-term unemployed and with the precariously employed. And in particular, I do research in South Africa and Namibia with the long-term unemployed there. And I think those two countries are really interesting as a focal point for these kind of questions, because they're some of the most unequal countries in the world. So inequality is extremely high. A lot of this inequality is based on a history of colonialism and racial dispossession. Besides inequality, both countries have really high and endemic unemployment levels. And these really high levels of unemployment have been around since at least the 1970s. So South Africa, for instance, pre-COVID, had an unemployment rate of nearly 30%. And once you include discouraged job seekers into that rate, it goes up to nearly 40%. And again, this was pre-COVID. So it seems like these are places that would be really ripe for radical redistributive demands. And in fact, they're sites of really interesting experimentation. So Namibia had a 2-year pilot in a village of universal basic income. In fact, the village where this pilot was run is one of my field sites where I conduct research now. And the pilot had really amazing positive results. And South Africa considered basic income politically in the early 2000s, but instead decided to do a system of direct cash transfers from the government to people who are physically unable to work, so children, the elderly, and the disabled. But even though the cash transfer system in South Africa is targeted, its focus is very much not a basic income, it does reach nearly 1/3 of the population in South Africa. And again, this is pre-COVID. So they're both places where these kind of ideas have been fermenting. So my empirical work there is focused on, as I said, the long-term unemployed, and is focused on talking to them about ideas such as universal basic income or other forms of kind of more universal distribution, and seeing what people's blocks are around these ideas. And I found two main blocks. And the first is that basic income, even though it might seem like an incredibly simple, straightforward, beautifully elegant idea, can be a surprisingly hard policy to understand, despite its seeming simplicity. And I think it must always come with some clarifications for people. And in particular, and Guy has already touched on these, but I just want to pick up two main ones that I think are really important that I now mention all the time when I talk about basic income. One is that when I talk about basic income, I'm talking about a redistributory policy that won't benefit the rich. So it would be taxed away or clawed back in some fashion from people who don't need it. And so one of the key benefits of basic income is, again, as Guy said, a way to curtail inequality. This also means that it actually costs a lot less than a lot of erroneous cost estimates would have us believe. Because often these cost estimates are focused on the gross cost of the policy. They're not taking into account the fact that you can tax it back from people who don't need it. And the second point I always like to clarify is that, again, as Guy said, basic income is complementary to other public goods and services, not a replacement. So things like health, education, housing, disability benefits, etc., would not be replaced by basic income, but rather complemented by this kind of livelihood security. But you don't need to go to South Africa and Namibia and do empirical work to find out that these are common confusions or misconceptions. All you have to do is read a lot of the journalism that comes out around basic income, and you can see exactly these kinds of confusions coming up again and again and again, which is quite frustrating. But from my own empirical work in Southern Africa, comes a second insight, which is a way of underscoring what actually economic sociologists have been saying for a while. And that is that money from different sources framed in different ways is understood differently by people. So for instance, Viviana Zalazar, who's an economic sociologist, shows in her work the way that people view bonuses or say lottery winnings as very different than say a pay raise. And it's also spent in a very different way. And this is what I see in my own empirical research with the long-term unemployed in Southern Africa. So with them, a framing of income or grants or transfers or welfare seems to invoke a kind of moral economy of deservingness that links income and work. And this sort of very much taps into that common saying that we so often hear, that you can't get money for nothing. And that's what I hear a lot from my interlocutors. People say, you have to work for money, you can't get money for nothing. If we get money for nothing, we'll become lazy, people will just sit, or that money will be misspent on things like alcohol and drugs, for instance, or frivolous things like hair products. That often comes up in my research. And it's really interesting the way that, of course, these are people who are very poor and who are really struggling to find jobs, and yet they're echoing the exact same kind of moral judgment so often heard amongst political elites when they're talking about these kind of policies. My interlocutors also very much see jobs rather than social grants from the state as part of becoming an agentive adult. So they say grants are fine for old people and children, but for us as adults, we need jobs. So there's a kind of widespread preference for job creation of government policy. And I think this is very much linked to a much broader moral economy that I think you can find anywhere. That's really focused on the capitalist work ethic, and basically rides on the belief that we must force people into work with the threat of destitution and poverty if they choose not to engage in wage work. But I think it's quite interesting that this kind of capitalist productivist work ethic is found even amongst people who have really struggled to access work. But you can see this obsession with the work ethic across the board, and even in the focus of so many universal basic income pilots, which of course, in many cases are set up by people who are supporters of basic income. But if you look at pilots and studies starting with the 1960s and 70s trials in the US and in Canada, there's a lot of focus on this central question of will people or won't people work if they get money? And I think this is very much an echo of exactly the same kind of moral worries that the people I speak to in South Africa and Namibia state to me. And touching on the recent basic income trial in Finland that Molly asked me to mention, you can see it there as well. So one of the key questions of the trial was the influence that basic income had on job uptake. In fact, it had a very slight but positive influence on job uptake. But what was more interesting to me than the actual results of the trial, which in a way are very predictable, was the kind of media response around it, where when these results first started coming up, there was a lot of negative media attention saying, you see, if you give people a basic income, they don't start working a lot more. So clearly the trial is a failure. And I found this incredibly surprising, that what you could very much spin as a success, look, even within the framework of the capitalist work ethic, people didn't work less if their livelihood was assured. You would think that this would be considered a success, was often spun by various press outlets as a failure. And of course, the other aspects of the Finland trial, such as the fact that well-being and flourishing, both mental and physical, really increased amongst participants, I think received much less attention in the press, which I think is really interesting and significant of the way all of us think about what's important and what isn't important. And of course, there are other questions around work that never came up at all. So, the focus was very much around job uptake. Well, what about unpaid work? What about care work that Guy mentioned? Was, the pilot kind of measuring the number of hours people spent taking care of each other? Was the increase of unpaid care work a positive variable in the pilot? So I think that this kind of deep focus on the Protestant capitalist work ethic is pervasive across both the people that I do research with and societies more broadly. And I think it's also incredibly classist. So people are very concerned with the poor receiving passive income, but somehow we're much less concerned with the rich receiving passive income, which of course the rich very much do from their investment income or from their property income, et cetera. And yet we're a lot less concerned about the rich becoming lazy or misspending their passive investment income than we are with the poor. So I think we need to consider the deeply classist element of these concerns as well. But the other key finding that's been coming out of my research that I think is equally important to mention here is that the framing really matters. So once I started reframing the basic income idea away from welfare, away from a social grant, away from a poverty reduction strategy, and towards something like a commons or natural resource dividend, again, exactly as Guy framed it in his talk, or a rightful share, say, of national wealth, or a rightful share of the wealth created by past generations, the very same people that I was speaking to earlier would shift what they had to say about it. So one of my interlocutors who was saying, you can't just get money for nothing, you can't just expect the state to pay you. When I reframed the idea as a share of natural resource wealth, and of course, South Africa had quite a lot of natural resources, quite a lot of mining industry, the same person said, oh, actually, I think that's a great idea. And I think that would be an excellent policy, and I think we should do it. And I said, well, you're just so worried a minute ago about this money being misspent on alcohol or people becoming lazy, et cetera. What about all of your concerns? And he said, well, actually, it's our money. If it's our money, then we can do what we want with it, right? It doesn't matter how you spend your money that's rightfully yours. So I think my research very much shows that we should move away from this language of grants, of poverty alleviation, of welfare. And I think that's why I'm actually a little bit worried about the effect of COVID on the basic income conversation. So on the one hand, it's gotten a lot more attention because of COVID, but on the other hand, so often I see it framed as a kind of as a response to a sort of a short-term crisis of work or a short-term crisis of economics, rather than the kind of reframing as a fundamental right or a dividend or justice or maybe a reparations, which I think is what will give basic income a much firmer base in people's political demands.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Liz. And to me, it's really valuable as somebody who's supported this policy theoretically for a long time to have somebody like you who's actually going out and doing the real nuts and bolts research and finding out what people think. It's really valuable. And if I can maybe suggest a slightly more positive interpretation of what's happening with COVID, I think I'd relate it back to what you were saying, where people can actually give you two different views at the same time. So they've got this view that's conditioned by market ideology, but they've also got a view that comes from their inherent humanity. And perhaps COVID has helped us discover that. But I completely take your point about, not presenting the response to COVID as one of a lot of people needing welfare help, more like the wealth that's out there should be shared, perhaps. Exactly. Anyway, we're all agreeing each other and being radical here, but you're fine to say something in support of the market system in the chat, and I'll pass it along. So right, I've got a few questions coming in, and I can actually, I think, ask you three of these questions sort of at the same time, if I get this right. So we've had a question from Christian, who asks, how likely is it that universal basic income will be fully implemented, and where will this happen first? And that relates to a question that I had, which is, I find it interesting that the countries that are making progress with this agenda, and I'm thinking of especially of the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, might not be the countries you'd expect. And it's actually in the richer countries that we're seeing, I would say, more resistance. Anyway, I'd be interested in your reflections on that. And then, because Christian also asks, are there different challenges for implementation of UBI in different countries or different regions, say Latin America compared to Europe? So perhaps if I put that little clutch of questions to you first, Guy, and then to Liz.
Let me see if I can deal with them all together. The first thing about how likely is it? Each time there's an economic crisis, the debate comes up. And in the past, I've been pessimistic about the likelihood. I think it's more than 50% the probability that at least one major country will introduce it. Several small countries have already done so, but they haven't received any attention. And I think that a country like South Korea, where one province is actually implementing a proper basic income at the moment, and I've just done a long interview with journalists from South Korea. I think that country is definitely a possible, as it were. And I think that where we've done pilots, there tends to be quite a big surge of extra support. I happened, Liz, to be a part of the designing team for the pilot in Namibia. And I was doing field work, going out various points, going out and talking to the villagers who were receiving the basic income. And there was a strong degree of support within the community and from outside the community, and that communicated. And I think that was a very positive approach to work. There was a big increase in work in that village that you've mentioned. And I talked to a number of people, and they were definitely gaining in that respect. In the case of Finland, I think the trouble has been that it's been misrepresented from the beginning. And I was there at the beginning in the Prime Minister's office advising on the design of the pilot. And they went the Minister of Finance went totally against our recommendations. And it wasn't a basic income pilot. They gave to 2,000 unemployed across the country, scattered randomly, instead of their unemployment benefits, they got a basic income without the conditions. But that is not a basic income. A basic income must be paid to everybody, regardless of work status, within a community, because you have network effects, you have feedback effects, you have community effects. That we've learned with our Canadian pilots, with other pilots, the Indian pilots. And of course, the right-wing Minister of Finance wanted it to fail and fed the newspapers. I got phoned by The Guardian and the BBC. Why has it failed? And I said, well, it hasn't failed, hasn't finished. It started on the day it said that it would start, and it finished on the day it was said to be finished. And the data weren't analyzed until the end of last year in Finnish and have come out this year in English, but nevertheless, they all said it failed. So they wanted it to fail. They wanted it to fail. And I think that we've had this difficulty, but I fully agree with Liz's point, which is that framing is so important. Framing is really important.
Liz, do you have any reflections on those? Maybe something about Brazil?
Yeah, well, I think there's a broader kind of enthusiasm that's been coming up in the past maybe 5 years about whether or not this will be a revolution from the global south, actually, not from the global north, and whether countries like Brazil or South Africa, maybe India, will sort of leapfrog all of the hesitations and the difficulties of countries in the global north. I think it's very hard to predict the future. I mean, South Africa, which is the focus of my work, has sort of been flip-flopping on basic income for now 20 years. And it's been running very hot and cold. So yeah, I'm not sure I would gamble on any particular country, but I think we might be surprised. Yeah, maybe it'll be South Korea, maybe it'll be some other place that we don't expect. But I think it's very hard to predict. But I will say that I think it's very exciting that a lot of the experimentation and a lot of the kind of partial implementation is happening in the global south, and that they are willing to kind of move further and move ahead and experiment much more than a lot of rich countries in the global north. I also think there's a question of, again, framing, but also funding. So I've been doing some recent work around thinking about reparations and whether a kind of global basic income could be conceived as a reparative policy, say reparations for slavery, reparations for colonialism. And that would be something else, right? Not a nationally based basic income, but a global basic income, or between a couple of different sets of nations, say Britain to its former colonies. Obviously, these are ideas that are quite radical and would encounter a lot of resistance, but it's also interesting to think of these kind of global framings of basic income as well.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Right, we're going to slightly overrun, but I've got two more questions now. I'm going to ask them separately because they don't really relate. So the first one is from Maria, and she asks, demand for UBI is advanced by social collectivities. How is this supported, this demand for the policy, supported by certain social movements and other demands? And how does it relate to social movements that are making other demands, such as, for example, the refusal of bullshit jobs? Would you like to have a go at that one first, Liz?
Sure. Well, I think this very much speaks to my interests in basic income. So I first became interested because I was working on the problem of work and the crisis of work. Or the many crises of work. So whether it's precarity and underemployment on the one hand, or overemployment and bullshit work on the other. And I think that we can very much tie together resistance to various problems with waged work in particular, and the divorce of kind of a fundamental basic livelihood from the necessity of being in the labor market. And I think in general, basic income could be an amazing stepping stone for a kind of decentering and a decommodification of work. Or maybe we don't call it work, we just call it meaningful or socially necessary activity, right? And we kind of start rethinking the wage altogether. So I think there's definitely a lot of overlap between these kind of movements critiquing work and thinking around post-work and basic income as well. And I think there are lots of other movements that spin out from that. So a lot of feminist demands around the recognition of care work and around broader support for people who are very much engaged in care work, I think also really overlap with basic income as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Guy, did you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the probability of a basic income system coming into existence is very much enhanced if it's linked to social movements. In our pilots in India, I worked with SEWA. I've been working with SEWA for 20 plus years. SEWA is the Self-Employed Women's Association. It's the union for women workers in the informal economy, if you like. It has over 2 million members. And once I was giving a talk and they said, look, why don't we try it in our areas? And in the design of our pilots, we had 9 areas, 4 where that SEWA was operational and 4 where they weren't, in a tribal area. And we watched to see what difference it made. And without a doubt, there was a greater sense of social solidarity that came through with the SEWA villages, if you like. But it had positive effects everywhere, although really positive effects. And it does engender a sense of solidarity and community and the other things that we would like to see from a strategy. One of the things that you will find in the Namibian thing, Liz, is that within a couple of months of the basic income pilot having been launched, the villagers set up a committee to advise villagers on how to spend their money and how to improve their lives and et cetera, et cetera. So it engendered a sense of community involvement. And that message, I think, once people hear it, transmits to others. So by the time we ended the pilots in India, which was much, much bigger than in Namibia, we had the Minister of Finance writing a report for Parliament saying it is affordable in India. It is affordable in India. And that debate is still going on, and it's very active at the moment. So I think the affordability question comes back into it. We haven't discussed that this evening. We won't start now, but I've indicated how it can be afforded by setting up a commons capital fund, a bit like the Norwegian fund or a bit like the Alaska Permanent Fund, from which basic income dividends have been paid out. So I think that many of these things come together. And the point I would like to emphasize with regard to Liz's presentation, with which I really strongly agree, is that the framing of this is going to will affect the probabilities of its being implemented. And I'm rather encouraged that framing and the vocabulary and the connections are actually evolving through this pandemic in exciting ways.
I've really taken that on board, as well as somebody who often advocates for this policy. I think that's very important about framing. Right, so I've got one final question, which I must confess is actually my question. And then if you'd like to make some final remarks, both, there's a bit of time for that as well. So this actually goes to the point about funding the basic income. And you talked about both precarious employment and the automation of employment, which, of course, if you think that your livelihood depends on the labour market, you need to panic about. If you think that you can fulfil your human dignity and flourish as an individual in a community without going to work, then it's really something to celebrate. But it's only something to celebrate if the value created through that automation is then used as a commons rather than going into the bank account of people like Jeff Bezos. And I'm quite interested by the fact that, some of those internet billionaires, I mean, Zuckerberg and Elon Musk as well, they're all big fans of the UBI, aren't they? So I'm just really raising the question of whether it lets them off the hook paying their employees badly and putting a lot of other people out of work. And do we therefore need to capture the value they're generating and use that to pay everybody a good income? Do you want to have a go at that one first, Guy?
Yeah, on the last part, peculiarly, because I'm hardly politically in the same way as they are, been asked to talk about basic income in Davos 3 times in a row, and in Silicon Valley to many of those executives that we're talking about, the plutocrats. And it is superficially surprising that many of them are coming out in favor of a basic income. But to be fair to them, which I don't like being, but to be fair to them, many of those people know the system is being disgracefully rigged in their favor. And they feel they've been winning far too much, many of them. They know that. It's a rigged system that is disgusting. It's just unethical in extreme. And they are genuinely thinking, unless there's some redistributive system, we're going to have social violence down the road very quickly. So I think that's mixture of pragmatic and looking at the technological changes and so on that makes them feel that way. But the affordability issue in Britain is very easy to solve. Build a commons fund. The Treasury admits that each year it loses revenue through tax reliefs and subsidies to middle and high income groups to the tune of over £430 billion. That is money given out that goes to wealthy people in subsidies in various forms. It's money for nothing. We should be able to pay a very big basic income if that system of subsidying to the wealthy were replaced by common dividends. And then we could do it with eco taxes and value taxes to top it up. But it is easily affordable without raising income tax at all in Britain. And that should be understood by people who say, oh, we couldn't possibly afford it. Or to back of the envelope calculations, multiply population by figure, and look, 400 billion, as the minister did the other day. It is a ridiculous back of the envelope prejudice, because they're giving out their own treasury estimates. I've got the figures, over 430 billion. So the Duke of Buccleuch, who has 277,000 acres of land, only because he's the 10th descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II gets, in addition, millions of pounds so that he can look after his land. This is how ridiculous the system is. And we need to frame it in terms of common justice. And then I think we will win big time.
Okay, thank you. Nice radical final point. Over to you, Liz.
Well, to the first part of your question about the tech billionaires, I'm very skeptical of them in the same way that I'm extremely skeptical of their philanthropy. And that is because I just don't think you can try to offshore your assets to avoid paying taxes and, you know, try to employ as many of your workers as contractors so you can avoid giving them sick leave and parental leave as possible, while at the same time projecting yourself as a kind of philanthropist that's fighting against inequality or tech. I mean, I just think you know, the proof is in the pudding. You really have to look at their policies when it comes to paying their corporate taxes and their employment policies. And I think that's where, you know, their real beliefs lie. And I think increasingly now there's a kind of broader critique and understanding of this kind of philanthropy that is pointing that out. But in general, I don't think we should be saving anyone from automation. I mean, I agree with Guy in that I'm pro automation if it means that we get to be liberated from drudgery. I think the real issue is who owns the automation, you know, as you said. So rather than saving people from automation, we need to give them what's theirs, right? What's ours. And I think to do that, we need to really challenge our intuitions around the origins of wealth and around meritocracy. And I think that's my other kind of big problem with the mythos of Silicon Valley. I actually grew up in Silicon Valley, so I have a particular chip on my shoulder around it. I think there's a particular mythos of meritocracy and deservingness there, right? Around the self-made man, the self-made millionaire, and there usually is a man, in fact. And you can see this very much in the kind of mythos around, for instance, Elon Musk, you know, how he tells journalists that he sleeps in his factories in the loudest place he can find to really suffer. And if he sleeps at all, you know, mostly he doesn't, right? So this, again, this reinforcement of the way that hard work makes us deserve our billions. And I think that's really what we need to break apart. And I think, again, framing things like, for instance, as Guy said, as a commons fund to really underscore that, right? To really break apart this idea that wealth comes from meritocracy is a really good way to move towards that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you both so much. And thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening. And I'm sorry we've overrun a little bit, but I hope you agree it was interesting stuff. And I'm also sorry that Israel never managed to join us, but maybe we'll be able to invite him to a future event. So just to conclude, I would say we've heard some pretty radical stuff, but also some very possible stuff. And one of the things everybody's wanting to do at the moment, including the Prime Minister, is to build back better. And so if you think having a basic income as part of your share of the commonwealth of the country and the world is part of a better world, then hope you'll join the campaign for citizens' income. Sorry, I'm supposed to be being academic and saying there's pros and cons, but I think we were all pretty much on the same page this evening. And anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and please join us for another event in future. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you.
Good night, good evening. Have a nice evening.